Well, here we are again. It's autumn. The wind's blowing. You can hear the birds in the background, but behind me we've got the first wattle. That's right, a quintessential Australian scene, which makes a good setting for a quintessential Australian issue. Educational apartheid in Australia. And I'm not talking about apartheid based on race or culture, but I'm talking about a more encompassing apartheid which is responsible for fashioning many of the attitudes which are prominent in this country. Now, Australia is a very unusual system as far as education is concerned. It has a private sector and a public sector. But the unusual part about Australian education is that the private sector is subsidised by the public sector. So about 1/3 of children go to private schools and about 2/3 continue to go to public schools, government funded schools. And as far as Commonwealth funds are concerned, although education is a state issue, the bulk of government funding goes to private schools, which is exceptionally unusual. Now, I have no problem with private education if people are willing to pay the full cost of that education. And that's the dilemma in Australia in 2021. It's the public sector is starved of funds and resources and teachers to keep the private sector funded. But more importantly than the type of education and who's funding what we are seeing in this country, what we've seen since the public subsidisation of private education, what we have seen is the creation of an apartheid system based on disposable income to a significant degree. It's an apartheid system which means that in the long term that children in Australian society don't mix in the early stages. They don't mix in primary school and they don't mix in secondary colleges. So we see a particular mindset developing in the private sector which thinks of everything as public as second rate and inefficient. And the dilemma is that this apartheid system, which is based on disposable income, creates two Australias. It creates a situation where, apart from the sporting field, there is minimal mixing of children. So there is little exercise as far as diversity is concerned. It's highly likely that most children in a private setting, school setting, would not be familiar with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, because most of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, because of economic circumstances, use the public sector. And it's highly likely that a significant portion of children in the private sector would never mix with children of parents who are on social security benefits. And when you realise that 1/3 of this country's population is on social security benefit, you don't have that mixing of the population. So you have separate development, not a separate development based on race or nationality or culture or national background, but a separate development based on the ability to to access education system, a separate development where there is minimal interaction, even on the sporting field, between those from a public school setting and those from a private school setting. And what this does, it sets the agenda for generations. Because if you have a significant proportion of the population which does not mix with the rest of the population, what you see is a development of ideas and ideology and practices which reinforce the status quo, which reinforce the inequalities that exist in society, and to a significant degree which prevent people who use the public sector from moving forwards as far as their careers are concerned because of the old school network. And what that means is many parents send their kids to private schools, not because it's a better education system, because of the contacts they make, the networks they form, the interaction which occurs. Now it's interesting that in Finland, a Western democracy, private education is banned. Even if you have the resources to pay for it, it is banned. And it is banned for one very good reason. Because if you have all children from different circumstances, different social settings, different economic situations, different racial origins, different nationalities, different languages, in the same classroom, there is a greater degree of mixing and a greater possibility that lifelong friendships will be formed which cross class barriers, which cross economic barriers, which mean you create a more cohesive, stronger society. Because people understand what other sections of the community have to face and what are going through. But having an apartheid educational system where you have certain viewpoints which are promoted in a private sector regarding society, then creates this division which continues lifelong and which has a negative influence on the type of society which we can become, and which destroys any possibility or most possibilities of people moving in society, moving in terms of their possibilities, their career possibilities, their life possibilities, because there is no mixing. And the problem becomes worse when we have over 40% of the population now renting, because home ownership has become almost impossible for a significant proportion of the population. With the current rental regulations and laws, what we are seeing is fewer and fewer children being able to maintain a stable education, especially children who rely on their parents renting, who don't have that stability. So we do have an educational apartheid, and it has lifelong consequences, and to a significant degree it highlights the difficulties that are faced in our society. When you have a government which thinks that having social security benefits that keep people below the poverty line, and they think this is normal because of their minimal interaction with significant sections of the population, we find ourselves in this situation. When you have governments which consistently elect people, when you have people that are consistently elected into government who have a limited range of possibility, who have a limited life experience, who have a limited opportunities to mix with sections of the population which they would normally not mix with because of educational apartheid, then you get the attitudes which have crept into the society which have been instrumental in creating and maintaining the divisions which continue to exist in Australian society. It's no accident that during this period, over the past 4 decades, when private education has received more and more public money at the expense of public education sector, it's no accident that we've seen the concepts of deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation achieve such an important hold on the public imagination, because these are the concepts which are highlighted and promoted in a private sector. Because the private sector, whether it's religious based or not, is basically a sector which is based on private investment for private profit. And it's the same in an apartheid educational system. Nowhere else in the world am I aware of, and I could be wrong, that governments pour so much money into private education. And to a significant degree, the role of the institutional churches, the legacy churches, has been fundamental in this shift, because what they would like us to believe is that their particular take on the planet is an important take. This is the joy of speaking in the backwoods. You occasionally hear a buzzsaw cutting wood, but that's the way it goes. But I think the important thing to remember is it is an apartheid system. It does increase inequality, and most importantly of all, it decreases understanding. Even as far as sporting interaction is concerned, there is minimal interaction between the public and private schools. There may be some interaction in clubs outside the school network. Well, we've moved. I think a buzzsaw is not very good for concentration. Maybe it's better than the wind and the birds, but who knows. So let's get back to what we were saying. We're talking about educational apartheid. So educational apartheid is not just about resources. It's not just about taxpayers' money being diverted to the private sector, as we see many spheres of influence in this country. But it's about creating 2 Australias who know very little about each other. 2 Australias who never seem to come together. 2 Australias with different viewpoints about what is important, what isn't important. And to a significant degree, it allows for the manipulation of those sections of society that are basically powerless and will continue to be powerless because of an education system which highlights that what we need in this country is more billionaires and more millionaires and more entrepreneurs and more philanthropists. Not more ethical and moral people who just don't think about themselves, but think about the community they are part of. And these attitudes grow early. These attitudes are formed early. And what makes matters even worse in 2021 is that the fact that the private schools now are offering significant numbers of scholarships to the brighter elements in the public sector. And they do this for one very good reason. Because when you remove those children from that setting, they take up the attitudes and the aspirations of those that educate them. And we see generation after generation children being lost in this educational apartheid battle. As far as I'm concerned, this is one of the most significant issues we face as a community. Because if we want a community that works well together, that is able to look after the needs of each and every one of its citizens and residents, if we want such a community, we need to do something about the educational apartheid which has become such a significant feature of our society, where we have streams of children who develop independently of each other, although they are part and parcel of the same community, who do not interact, who do not talk to each other, who don't play sport with each other, who find themselves in a situation where when they leave school they don't have the networks or the mechanisms via which to enjoy what this nation has to potentially offer each and every one of us. The best way to tackle educational apartheid is to stop money going from the public purse into the private purse as far as education is concerned. If parents and guardians want to educate their children privately, they should pay the full cost of that education. There is nothing stopping them from sending their children to a public school if they can't pay that full cost. And the spurious argument that they pay taxes, therefore some of those taxes should come back to them, holds no water, because it doesn't exist in the other sphere of human activity in this country. So by removing the financial incentive to private schools, we would have a much larger number of children going to the public sector. There'd be more mixing of people from different economic groups, more mixing of people from different racial origins, cultures, religions, and we would see a much more compact, a much more interesting, and most importantly of all, a much fairer society where each and every child can enjoy the bounties that this land can offer them, because this is a rich country. And to have private organisations sponsoring kids in public schools because they haven't got enough resources to access those public schools is, I think, one of the greatest evils, and I do use the word evil, that we have seen, that we can't even provide the basic necessities. And to a significant degree, this has occurred because of the educational apartheid, which is now seems to be a fixed, permanent feature of Australian society. And that's why public interest before corporate interest has always had a program, has always had policies which talk about putting public education before private education and ensuring that private assets, that public assets do not find their way into the private education system.